The Catholic Morning Show on Iowa Catholic Radio.
When you're thinking about what it means to be church as a social body, as a social group, as a community, we hear Pope Leo XIV time and time again turn to the theme of unity. Unity is something we all seemingly want, but what does that actually mean in terms of Christian theology? And what are we to do about that? We have Dr. John Huynh on for his monthly segment from the Diocese of Des Moines, Director of Social Justice, precisely to think about that point. John, thanks for coming on the Catholic Morning Show.
Hi, Bo. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So as we said, Leo repeatedly calls Christians to be a force for unity, and especially in contrast to the increased polarization our world is facing. What does Christian unity actually mean, and how is it different than simply avoiding disagreement?
I think you hit on the right point in when you were saying that he's obsessed with unity. And of course, which Pope isn't, right? He started this whole thing with his inaugural Mass in St. Peter's Square. And then recently he was at the annual Communion and Liberation Gathering. And he talked again about unity, calling for unity. And I think at the heart of the matter, we have to distinguish unity from uniformity. And it's important to note that Christian unity does not mean that everyone thinks alike or never disagrees. It certainly doesn't mean that truth becomes unimportant. I think for the sake of keeping the peace, if we want to look at it from a theological perspective, the model for unity is ultimately the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, distinct persons and yet perfectly one. And so Christianity has always had this remarkable understanding that difference and unity are not enemies. And in fact, genuine communion requires that particular distinction. If there's no difference between you and me, there really isn't communion at all. And so I think what the church can offer here is something desperately much needed right now. When I go to Mass, I notice I don't get to choose the people sitting around me. And in fact, because we arrive, this is terrible to say, but we arrive late. Often the ushers will usher you in and sit you with people who you don't know. And you get to greet in some sense at the end of the Mass. And you can have Republicans sitting next to Democrats, everything. So all of them, though, at the Mass approach the same altar. They receive the same Jesus. And that's a radically different understanding of community and communion built upon affinity. The church isn't supposed to be a collection, essentially, of people who agree with one another. We are people gathered in Jesus. We're gathered by Christ. And so when I hear Pope Leo and his predecessors call for unity, I'm not seeing him asking us to pretend that our differences don't matter. What I hear is an invitation. Can we love one another even when those differences remain? Can truth and charity go hand in hand? And for us, they have to. They must.
Well, forgive me for interjecting two things. I love this so much. It makes me immediately think of one of my favorite quotes from a thinker named Gilson, who says, "What is distinct can be unified. What is mixed can only be confused." And like you say, uniformity means just like making a big old slush of the same thing. But what's an actual unified thing? Well, the body is unified, but it has absolutely distinct parts. Its distinctions are what make it able to function as a body. And so I love that idea, right? That we shouldn't give in to what the Benedictines call a false peace or just act like we all have to think the same, but a unified purpose that makes distinct parts come together. And I think that goes into, something else that you wanted to talk about. The Pope has suggested that divisions in society are not simply political problems, but actually reflect wounds within the human heart. Sin, but also just a woundedness because of creatureliness. From the perspective of Catholic social teaching, then, what is polarization doing to the way that we see and treat one another?
There's an old Christian insight to this, that sin directs us towards our own selves, right? It turns us inwards. And I think polarization does that. It does that collectively. We tend then to label people. Our group becomes essentially, the group of people I agree with becomes the measure of everything. And we then begin to notice sins of other people, other side, quote unquote, the other side, with great clarity. But we have such an opaque view of our own shortcomings. And Catholic social teaching challenges that, because solidarity requires me to recognize a bond with people I did not choose, and people who I disagree with. So that doesn't mean that every position is equally true, or every action is equally good. But there is a profound difference between judging an idea and rejecting the dignity of the person when we begin to label them as, as the other. And I think that's one of the wounds that Pope Leo is talking about and is asking us to examine before we can really hone in and fix the polarization that exists in some sense out there, as we call it. We have to ask ourselves, what has that done to us? Have I become contemptuous? Do I secretly enjoy others being humiliated, or the other side being humiliated? Am I capable of recognizing good in people whom I disagree with? And so those questions, as you see, are no longer political questions, right? They're questions about who we are as persons. They're questions that require us to attend to our own heart and our own conversion.
Dr. John Huynh has put this so well. Diocese of Des Moines Director of Social Justice, speaking about the Pope Leo XIV's emphasis on unity. You want to be part of the solution. You might be tired of all of this polarization, but you also might be confused about what we can do practically. So, John, one more time to ask you, what does it look like if we're going to be called to heal these divisions? What do we do in the practical meantime? How can Catholics engage people with maybe we strongly disagree with, but all while not compromising truth, and also not just simply retreating into our own camps?
I think the first thing is to recover the art of conversation, actually facing the other person, having a cup of coffee, chatting, stop commenting or tweeting about things, right? Because it's easy to sit behind a keyboard or on our phone to say very nasty things. So sitting across someone to see that person, recognizing that inherent dignity, that worth, and that love, that's very different, again, from agreeing with them. It's simply sitting down and trying to come to the truth. I think, and a second thing is to deliberately maintain relationships that could cross boundaries, because naturally we be friends with people who share the same viewpoints as us, the same outlook in life. But if I speak regularly to just a person who shares my politics, my social views, my economic circumstances, then my world becomes a bit too small. And then finally, I'd say this, and this is the most important thing, I think, is to recover a hermeneutics of charity. In other words, recover an interpretation of charity rather than a hermeneutics of suspicion, right? We tend to assume the worst in people when they do things. Well, let's assume the best in them. Is that something that we can recover? Because in doing so, we begin to see the person as a person rather than a label and a camp. Absolutely.
If your social life begins to look like how you interpret people when they're driving and not using their blinker. That might be an indication that we've gone down the wrong path. Dr. John Huynh is the Director of Social Justice for the Diocese of Des Moines. Before we let you go, John, you guys do so much precisely towards this work of unity. Maybe what are some of the things that might be coming up, or places that people can go find out more about what your office is up to?
Yes, I think folks can benefit greatly by going to dmdiocese.org/events. There we have collated all of the, not all, but pretty much almost all of the events that are happening around the diocese, in particular at the parishes, because I think, we're talking about unity. Unity, as Bo, you and I have had this conversation before, things begin on a smaller scale, and it has to happen closer to home. And so these things have to happen at the parish level, at the local level, and not just, something that's national or regional. And so if folks want to go to dmdiocese.org/events, they'll find all of those things, the events that are happening around the diocese at their local parishes or the parishes near them that they can join.
Absolutely wonderful. Diocese of Des Moines, Director of Social Justice, Dr. John Huynh, speaking about the emphasis of unity by Pope Leo XIV in Catholic social teaching. John, thank you so much for coming on the Catholic Morning Show.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Listen to the Catholic Morning Show weekdays at 7 a.m. Central on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network, iowacatholicradio.com, or the Iowa Catholic Radio app.
It's time to man up. Mondays at 9 a.m. Central. Man Up with Joe Stopulus on Iowa Catholic Radio and on demand on the Iowa Catholic Radio app. This is Iowa Catholic Radio, connecting people to Christ.